The first time I saw it, I thought it was another aircraft, maybe a tanker or another B-52 cutting across the dark Dakota sky. At altitude, shapes often deceive the eye, turning stars into planes, planes into stars, shadows into threats. But this was different. The light grew brighter, sharper, until it seemed to burn against the glass of our cockpit. It wasn't blinking like a navigation light, and it wasn't moving like any plane I had ever seen. It hung there, just off our right wing, glowing with steady brilliance that lit the fuselage as if the moon itself had drawn too close. For a moment, it cast our bomber in silver white, every rivet and panel edge outlined like a knife in moonlight. "Contact 2 o'clock," the co-pilot said, his voice tight, clipped in the way men speak when their minds are racing faster than their tongues. I leaned forward, pressing closer to glass, my breath fogging the edges of the window. The object wasn't just light. It had form, a structured glow, almost metallic beneath the shimmer, as though the radiance was more a byproduct than the thing itself. And as we watched, our instruments registered what our eyes already knew. Something was there. Radar confirmed a solid contact, pacing us, as though studying our every move. We were flying a training mission that night in October 1968, a routine operation out of Minot Air Force Base. Routine was a rhythm of the Cold War. Practice runs, target simulations, endless drills meant to ensure that if the order ever came, there would be no hesitation. But in that instant, routine vanished. The silence in the cockpit stretched thin, every man on board realizing the same impossible truth. We weren't alone up there. And then it moved. The object surged ahead, impossibly fast, cutting across our flight path before stopping dead. Stopping in a way no aircraft could. Our B-52, massive and heavy, groaned in the air as we adjusted, but the light simply hovered, waiting, as if daring us to follow. The radio crackled. Ground control called in, voices edged with disbelief. Guards near the missile silos were reporting lights over the fields, glowing objects hovering low to the ground. The reports matched what we were seeing above the clouds. The sky and the earth had become mirrors, each reflecting the same impossible presence. That was the night of October 24th, 1968. And it was a night I learned that the sky could hold secrets no training manual had ever prepared us for. Hours earlier, it had been just another mission. The Dakota plain stretched black beneath us, dotted with a faint glow of farmhouses and the rigid geometry of missile sites scattered across the land. The Cold War made this territory one of the most heavily guarded in America. Beneath those fields sat silos of Minuteman nuclear missiles, each one a slumbering giant we swore to protect. Inside the aircraft, the crew was tired but steady. Long flights had a rhythm, checklists, radio chatter, the low rumble of engines like a second heartbeat. We talked quietly about families, about the weather, about the monotony of drills that never seemed to end. The Cold War was fought in hours like these, endless waiting, endless readiness, the promise of destruction always hovering but never unleashed. The navigator, Harris, fiddled with his instruments, muttering about calibrations. The gunner, seated aft, told a story about his kid's little league game, his voice drifting over the intercom like a fragile tether back to normal life. For a while, the hum of the engines and the chatter lulled me into familiar cocoon of flight. None of us expected that night to be different. None of us imagined we would become witnesses to something that decades later would still defy explanation. The first call came from the ground. Security teams near one of the missile sites reported a strange light moving low across the fields. At first, command dismissed it as a misidentification, a plane, maybe a star refracted through the night air. But as more calls came in, the pattern became harder to ignore. Lights hovering, lights moving against the wind, lights that descended close to the silos before shooting skyward at impossible speed. We received the reports even as we tracked our own contact. The object outside our window glowed steadily, shifting in hue from white to orange to red, as if its skin carried some strange spectrum beyond our comprehension. It moved with purpose, matching our course, then darting ahead, then circling back. Each maneuver violated everything we knew about aerodynamics. And yet there it was, solid on our radar, undeniable to our eyes. The navigator's voice broke the spell. "It's pacing us," he muttered. Pacing, a word that carried weight. It was what enemy aircraft did when shadowing our bombers during tense missions. It meant surveillance. It meant evaluation. It meant being measured. I felt my chest tighten. This wasn't a Soviet fighter. No jet could match the speed we had just witnessed. No jet could hover without sound. No jet could stop in midair as though gravity had been suspended. The silence among us grew heavier. Each man gripped his station tighter, as if holding to the instruments could anchor us against the impossible. I looked again out the window. The object pulsed brighter, as if aware of our gaze. For a moment, it felt less like we were watching it and more like it was watching us. That was when I realized this wasn't random. It was an accident. It was intent. And intent meant intelligence. I often wonder what you would have felt in that moment. If you were strapped into that bomber, high above the frozen plains, staring at a glowing object that moved with impossible speed and precision, would you have felt awe, terror? Or would you have felt, as I did, the unsettling weight of being studied? Because that was how it felt. The object stayed with us for what felt like hours, though the clock measured only minutes. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it shot upward, vanishing into the night sky. The radar screen cleared, the cockpit dimmed, and silence filled the space it left behind. But on the ground, the story was still unfolding. Guards were still calling in, still reporting lights near the silos. Something had come to mind at that night. Something that moved across both earth and sky. Something that silenced even the most skeptical voices. And as we descended back toward the base, the weight of what we had seen pressed heavier with every mile. Because once you witnessed the impossible, you could not return to routine. And soon, the reports from ground and air would collide, weaving a story no officer wanted to write, and no commander wanted to explain. Back at Minot, the official night reports piled higher than the stacks of flight manuals in our ready room. Paperwork was the lifeblood of the Air Force. If it wasn't logged, it hadn't happened. But this time, the reports were written with a peculiar tension, as if every officer, every airman, every guard who had witnessed something was caught between duty and disbelief. The incident didn't end when we touched down. If anything, it had only begun. On the ground, the base was buzzing. Security teams had been scrambled to silo locations. Entire convoys of jeeps roared across the prairie roads in search of intruders that weren't supposed to exist. The guard transmissions, some later declassified, described luminous objects descending so low they cast shadows across the fields. Some men swore they saw shapes, domed craft with structured edges, hovering silently above the earth. And then there was the matter of the silos themselves. Around 3 a.m., multiple launch facilities experienced power anomalies. Warning lights on the consoles at the command center blinked red, then cleared, as if the system itself had been tampered with. In the Cold War, any disturbance near a nuclear weapon site was treated as an act of war. But how could one report to Washington that the culprits were glowing spheres of light that danced through the sky like fireflies with intelligence? The brass didn't want the word UFO written into the record. Not officially. The term used was unidentified aerial phenomena, a phrase meant to sound clinical, almost boring. But no amount of careful wording could erase the raw fact. Something unknown had breached the most secure airspace in America, and none of us could stop it. After we landed, the crew was escorted into a briefing room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and chalk dust. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, a haze that seemed to make the fluorescent lights buzz louder than usual. An intelligence officer in a crisp uniform leaned against the table, his face composed but his eyes betraying unease. "You will write down what you saw," he said. His voice was steady, official. "You will describe it in detail, and you will not discuss this outside this room." Understood. We nodded. What else could we do? The navigator wrote first, sketching the object's relative position, its shifts in color, the way it darted ahead, and then stopped with precision. The co-pilot scribbled down how radar confirmed the contact, then suddenly lost it. The gunner described nothing but the glow, admitting he was too far back in the plane to make out the structure. Each account was slightly different, filtered through position and perspective, but the core remained identical. We had encountered something beyond explanation. When it was my turn, I hesitated. My pencil hovered over the paper. I wanted to write the truth, to describe the sense of being studied, of intent radiating from that hovering light. But how does one write down a feeling? How do you explain to military intelligence that the object didn't just appear, it interacted, that it chose to follow us? I settled for the facts. Position, size, speed, maneuvers. The rest I kept to myself. When we were finished, the intelligence officer gathered our reports into a neat stack. He didn't look relieved. If anything, his jaw tightened. He knew what we had written would cause problems for someone higher up. This never leaves a room, he repeated. But secrets have a way of slipping through cracks. Over the following days, whispers spread across the base. Crews swapped stories in the mess hall. Guards shared nervous jokes at the gates. Some claimed that photographs had been taken by ground personnel, though no one ever produced one. Others swore that entire silos had gone offline during the sightings, a scenario so dangerous it bordered on treason to even suggest. And yet, despite the attempt at silence, the event left its mark. One night, a week later, I found myself in the officers' club, nursing a watered-down whiskey. Harris, the navigator, slid into the seat across from me. His face was pale, drawn. "You ever get the feeling," he said quietly, "that we weren't just watched, that we were tested?" I didn't answer right away. The jukebox in the corner played some forgettable tune, the kind of song meant to drown out thought. But Harris's words cut through it. "Tested how?" I asked, like they want to see how we'd react, how our systems would react. They weren't just flying around. They were probing. I swallowed hard. I had been trying to push that same thought from my mind. The way the object had paced us. The timing of the power fluctuations at the silos. None of it felt random. But saying it aloud gave it weight. We sat in silence. Two men who had been trained to fight Soviet bombers, now admitting, without fully saying, that the enemy might not be human. Officially, the incident was classified. Reports were stamped and locked away. The public explanation, when one was offered at all, was unusual atmospheric phenomena. A phrase so bland it might as well have been a lullaby. But among us, the memory lived on. In the months that followed, strange things continued to happen. Guards patrolling missile sites swore they saw lights again, sometimes in pairs, sometimes in trios, always vanishing when jets scrambled to intercept. A few men requested transfers. Others began drinking more than usual. One guard was found staring blankly at the sky long after his shift had ended, whispering that the lights were still out there. For me, the hardest part was the silence. We were trained to share information, to debrief, to analyze. But here, the order was secrecy. And in secrecy, memory festers. Years later, I would still dream of that night. I would hear the low drone of the engines, see the glow out the window, feel the weight of intelligence pressing down from the darkness. Sometimes the dream ended with the object vanishing, as it had in reality. Other times, it ended differently, with the light engulfing the cockpit, with a brilliance that erased the world. I would wake in a sweat, heart pounding, as though some part of me still lingered in that frozen Dakota sky. And always, in the quiet hours of wakefulness, I asked myself the same question. Why us? Why mine it? Why that night? The answers never came. But the questions never left. By the winter of 1968, mine it had settled back into its uneasy rhythm. The days were filled with routine drills, the nights with endless readiness. From the outside, it appeared as though nothing had changed. But for those who had been there on October 24th, everything was different. The incident became a ghost that lingered in the hallways. It was never named aloud, but it was always present like static in the air. Men avoided the subject, yet their silence spoke volumes. In the barracks, conversations broke off the moment footsteps approached. In the mess hall, glances were exchanged when the night sky was mentioned. One evening, I found myself on perimeter duty near one of the silos. The planes were so still that every creak of the frostbitten fence seemed deafening. I watched the horizon, the stars glittering sharp against the black, and I couldn't shake the memory of that hovering glow. The guard beside me, a young airman named Collins, finally spoke. "You saw it too, didn't you?" His voice was barely a whisper, almost stolen by the wind. I didn't answer right away. Silence was safety. But the look in his eyes told me he already knew. They told us not to talk, I said. They told us a lot of things, he replied, his breath steaming in the cold. But whatever that was, it wasn't ours, and it sure as hell wasn't Russian. I nodded. That much was undeniable. Collins leaned closer. You ever wonder if maybe it wasn't from here at all? The question hung between us, heavier than a rifle slung on our shoulders. I had thought it, of course. We all had. But to speak it aloud was to cross a line, from soldiers guarding missiles to men admitting we had seen something that challenged the very framework of the Cold War. I didn't answer. Some truths are too heavy to share. Weeks turned into months. Reports still trickled in. Strange lights near missile fields, unidentified contacts on radar that vanished when fighters closed in. But the official stance remained the same. Misidentifications, atmospheric anomalies, radar glitches. Behind closed doors, though, there were whispers of something larger. One afternoon, Harris pulled me aside after a navigation exercise. His eyes darted to make sure no one else was listening. I heard from a guy in security, he said. The night of the incident, 2 launch facilities went into no-go status. Dead. Just like that. That's impossible, I said. The systems are hardened against interference. Redundant. It can't just shut down. I'm telling you what I heard. And it wasn't just us. Malmstrom had something similar a year ago. Lights in the sky, missiles going offline. The hair on my neck stood up. If it had happened elsewhere, then this wasn't an isolated event. It was a pattern. But no one's supposed to know, Harris continued. They'll bury it. They always do. He was right. The military's first instinct was containment, not just of threats, but of information. The Cold War thrived on secrets, and this was a secret too big to release. The more I thought about it, the more the event gnawed at me. Why would someone, be interested in our missile sites? Was it curiosity, surveillance, a warning, or something else entirely? I remember the feeling in the cockpit that night, the sense of being observed, evaluated. It was as if the object had been less interested in us as individuals and more in what we carried, in what we represented. A-B, 52 bomber bristling with potential for nuclear delivery. Below us, fields filled with silent missiles, each one capable of ending a city. Perhaps that was the draw. Not the men, but the weapons. And if that was true, then the implications were staggering. In early 1969, I was called back into a closed-door meeting. A colonel I had never met before stood at the front of the room, his ribbons glinting under the harsh light. He spoke calmly, but there was no mistaking the underlying message. What you saw was a matter of national security, he said. There will be no further discussion of it, not inside this base, not outside. Do you understand? We nodded, a room full of obedient soldiers. But the silence he demanded only deepened the unease. That night, I lay awake in the barracks, staring at the ceiling. The colonel's words echoed in my mind. National security. Usually that meant the Soviets. But this was something else entirely. Something the colonel couldn't name. And yet, he was right about one thing. It was bigger than us. Bigger than the base. Bigger than the war we thought we were fighting. The years marched on. Men rotated out, new recruits filled the bunks, and the machinery of the Cold War churned relentlessly forward. But those of us who had been there on October 24th carried a memory like a hidden scar. Some drank it away. Some buried it beneath layers of silence. A few left the service altogether, unable to reconcile what they had seen with the world they thought they understood. As for me, I stayed. I kept flying, kept serving, kept the memory locked away. But every time I looked out into the night sky, I felt the weight of unseen eyes staring back. And sometimes on the loneliest nights, I wonder if they were still out there, waiting, watching, measuring. Because deep down I knew the truth. That night at mine, it hadn't been the end of something. It had been the beginning. Decades have passed since that frozen night in North Dakota. But the memory of it remains as sharp as the chill that seeped through the cockpit windows of our bomber. Years turned into careers, careers into retirements, and yet the night of October 24th, 1968, refuses to fade. For a long time, silence was our duty. Silence was our shield. We signed papers, took oaths, and pretended the world was no larger than the Cold War boundaries mapped in our manuals. But silence does not erase memory. It only buries it deeper. The story lived in whispers, among soldiers who trusted each other enough to share it in quiet corners of the officers' club, among guards who couldn't carry the burden alone, among officers who wondered if their oaths had been meant to protect the truth or to bury it. The official record stayed the same. A malfunction, a glitch, nothing unusual. But we knew better. In the 1990s, cracks began to appear in the silence. Some of the reports were declassified, redacted pages, black bars covering details, but enough to stir old ghosts. Civilian researchers filed Freedom of Information requests and unearthed fragments, radar logs, transcriptions of security transmissions, fragments of our testimonies. For the first time in decades, I read my own words on paper, photocopied and archived. Dry, clinical language. Object observed pacing aircraft. Radar contact confirmed. Object accelerated and disappeared. But behind those clipped phrases lived a memory of awe and terror I could never fully capture in ink. I wasn't the only one revisiting the past. Harris called me one evening, his voice older, raspier, but still carrying the weight of that night. "They're finally admitting some of it," he said. "Not all, but enough. You think the world's ready for the rest." I didn't know how to answer. Perhaps the world is never ready for truths that rewrite its boundaries. In retirement, I sometimes speak to small groups, history classes, veterans halls, the occasional UFO conference. I don't embellish. I don't need to. The truth is strange enough. I tell them about the globe pacing our wing, the impossible maneuvers, the power anomalies at the silos. I tell them how silence was enforced, how memory was compartmentalized. And I tell them how, even now, I cannot shake the feeling that we were part of something larger, an experiment, a test, a message. Some nights, I walk out into my backyard, far from the noise of the city, and stare at the sky. I find myself listening for the low hum of engines, scanning for a glow that doesn't belong. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I see it, a light moving too fast, stopping too suddenly, vanishing too cleanly. Maybe it's imagination, maybe it's memory, or maybe it's them, still out there, watching as they always have. One memory stands above the rest, as vivid now as it was then, after the incident. Long after the reports had been filed and the orders given, I found myself alone in the hangar one night. The B-52 loomed above me, its black frame blotting out the ceiling lights, its fuselage scarred by weather and time. I placed my hand on the cold metal skin and remembered the glow reflecting across its surface. For a moment, I felt like the bomber itself carried a memory, as though steel and rivets could hold secrets alongside men. I whispered then, to no one but myself, we weren't alone up there, and the silence that followed felt like agreement. The Cold War ended. The missiles that mined it were deactivated, the silos decommissioned. Grass grew where once nuclear fire had slept. But the memory of that night did not rust away with the silos. History will record the Cold War in terms of treaties, standoffs, and brinkmanship. But for those of us who were there, the war was also fought in silence, against questions too large for the world to hear. We trained for an enemy across the ocean. What we found instead was an enigma above our heads. And that enigma, perhaps, lies a truth far greater than any ideology. Because if we were being watched that night, if our weapons were being tested, then it means that humanity's struggles were never just our own. It means we were players in a story older, larger, and stranger than the Cold War could ever contain. I am an old man now. My hands tremble when I hold a coffee cup. My voice cracks when I speak too long. But when I close my eyes, I am 25 again, strapped into a bomber, staring at a glow that defied every law I knew. And I still ask myself, why us? Why there? Why then? Perhaps the answer will never come. Perhaps it already has, in ways we cannot recognize. But I know this much. That night, over the frozen plains of North Dakota, the universe opened a door, and for a fleeting moment we saw through it. The memory is a weight I carry, but also a gift, proof that the world is wider, stranger, and more mysterious than we were ever taught to believe, and that somewhere beyond the clouds, intelligence watches still. While we were still in the air, struggling to comprehend what we had just seen from the cockpit of the B-52, the real storm was unfolding on the ground. Security teams of the missile silos were reporting lights with increasing urgency, their voices tight with fear over the radio. The missile fields in North Dakota stretched for miles, flat plains dotted with hardened silos, each one housing a Minuteman nuclear missile. Those silos were more than concrete and steel. They were symbols of America's power, guardians of deterrence in a world balanced on the edge of nuclear fire. The guards posted their new monotony better than anyone. Long hours of stillness broken only by the occasional sweep of headlights or the low groan of wind across the prairie. Most nights, the routine was suffocating. Men leaned against jeeps, smoked too much, drank stale coffee from thermos bottles, and counted the hours until relief arrived. They feared human threats, saboteurs, infiltrators, the remote possibility of Soviet operatives. But they had never been trained for what came on the night of October 24th, 1968. The first call came from a team near a silo north of Minot. Their report was terse, their words jagged with disbelief. They had seen a glowing object hovering low, perhaps 100 feet above the ground. It wasn't a helicopter. There was no rotor wash, no sound. It wasn't a plane. It moved too slowly, too deliberately, drifting like a phantom across the field. It pulsed with an orange-white glow that lit up the frost-covered grass, casting long, eerie shadows across the flat earth. One guard, his voice quaking, shouted into the radio as the object drew closer to the silo. They were trained for intruders, for men with explosives or cutting torches, not for silent spheres of light. One later admitted that he raised his rifle, finger trembling on the trigger, but froze. How do you fire at something that seems alive, yet not alive, that moves like thought itself? Within minutes, more calls poured in. Another team miles away described the same sight, glowing orbs drifting silently above their post. Some swore the lights lowered until they were almost brushing the fences, as though studying the barriers meant protect America's most devastating weapons. Others reported narrow beams of light descending from the objects, sweeping across the ground as if scanning, illuminating the fields with ghostly precision. One guard confessed later, in a hushed voice, that he crouched behind his truck in pure terror. He pressed his back against the cold steel, weapon useless in his hands, as the glow moved overhead. He said it felt as if the light itself could see through him, through the truck, through every wall, every secret. He told me he had never felt so small, so exposed. Back at base command, chaos reigned. Radios buzzed and overlapped, reports stacking so quickly that officers could hardly make sense of them. Panic in disciplined voices was worse than screams. It meant the unimaginable had breached the ordinary. Then came the chilling connection. The object we had tracked from the cockpit of the B-52 matched the descriptions from the silos. Different vantage points, different eyes, but the same impossible presence sweeping across North Dakota. In the launch control centers, officers stared at their panels, at the delicate lines of lights that represented readiness and deterrence. They forced calm into their voices, but I knew what they were thinking. If something could hover near the silos unchecked, what else could it do? Could it tamper with the systems? Could it silence our missiles? The weapons we believed to be untouchable suddenly felt fragile, as though concrete, steel, and codes were nothing against the unknown. I remember vividly the hours after we landed. We stumbled from the aircraft still shaken, still locked in silence, only to be met by guards whose pale faces told their own story. They spoke in bursts, words tumbling from their mouths as though too heavy to keep inside. These were not excitable men. These were hardened guards, men accustomed to the dead hours of the night. For them to admit fear was proof enough that something had shattered their world. One young guard described how the object descended to treetop level, so low he could see the branches of a nearby stand of pines glowing under its light. No wings, no rotors, no sound, he said, his eyes wide, still wet with panic. Just light, but more than light. Something inside the light. Another swore the object had followed their truck as they drove a lonely service road, gliding overhead as if tethered to them. For nearly a mile it tracked them, moving silently, before shooting off at an angle that no aircraft could match, vanishing into the stars with terrifying ease. Their accounts did not contradict. They reinforced each other. Piece by piece, the picture grew clearer. The same presence that had paced us in the skies was moving across the missile fields, inspecting, observing, testing. The tension inside the base rose with every testimony. Commanders barked orders, voices cracking under the strain of keeping order. Men clutched rifles tighter, though none dared use them. Radios were kept hot, every voice carrying urgency, every transmission feeding the dread that whatever this was, it was coordinated, deliberate, intelligent. And above it all hung the unspoken truth. The security we swore to uphold had been breached, not by Moscow, not by saboteurs, but by something nameless, something beyond comprehension. I often wonder what you would have done if you had been one of those guards that night, standing in the freezing dark, rifle in hand, while a glowing object drifted silently above your post. Would you have fired? Would you have run? Or would you, like most of us, have stood frozen, heart-hammering, powerless before something that mocked the very laws of our world? For the men on the ground, that night left scars deeper than any wound. Scars of the mind, of the soul. No report could erase them. No order could suppress them. As air and ground testimonies merged, the puzzle deepened. This was no isolated sighting. It was a sweep, a coordinated operation across miles of frozen prairie. Dozens of men, separated by distance but united by terror, saw the same lights, felt the same dread. And when those accounts converged, the silence from above, from Washington, from the brass, from anyone who might have explained, became heavier than ever. The testimonies of the guards spread quickly, carried by rumor and fear through the base like wildfire. By the time dawn broke over the frozen prairie, dozens of men had seen something they could not explain, and the chain of command was struggling to hold together the fragile order of Minot Air Force Base. In the hours after the incident, we were herded into a windowless briefing room, its cinder-block walls painted the same dull green as every other military space of the era. The air was heavy with cigarette smoke. Coffee steamed in paper cups, but no one touched it. Sleep-deprived eyes darted around the room, searching for answers that wouldn't come. At the front stood a colonel we had never met before. His uniform was immaculate, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. He looked less like a leader and more like a wall, a barrier between us and the truth. "You will write down exactly what you saw," he said. His voice carried the weight of an order, not a request. "You will describe it in detail, and then you will not discuss it again. This is a matter of national security." The words national security hung in the air like a curse. It meant this incident had already left the confines of Minot. Somewhere, far above our pay grade, decisions were being made about what the world could and could not be allowed to know. One by one, the men put pen to paper. The navigator drew diagrams of the object's movement, arrows cutting across the page at angles no aircraft could match. The co-pilot described the radar contact, how it appeared solid, undeniable, then blinked away as if swallowed by nothingness. A guard's account was read aloud by an officer, his words raw, unfiltered, trembling with fear. It hovered over the silo. It was like it was looking inside. Then it shot up and was gone. No sound, no wings, nothing human. When my turn came, I hesitated. The pencil felt foreign in my hand. How do you describe intent? How do you explain the feeling of being measured, of intelligence pressing down from the dark? I wrote what I could, altitude, position, changes in color, but the truth was larger than paper could hold. When the reports were collected, the colonel stacked them neatly, placed them in a folder stamped in red. Classified. Then he looked at us, his eyes hard. "This incident never happened," he said. But it had. The silence that followed was heavier than any order. Men tried to bury what they had seen, but memories do not rot so easily. In the barracks, whispers continued. In the chow hall, guards traded nervous jokes to mask their unease. Out by the silos, some men refused to stand alone at night. I remember one young airman, Collins, who pulled me aside during a perimeter patrol. His face was pale, his voice hushed. "Sir, they told us not to talk, but he swallowed hard. What if it comes back?" I didn't know how to answer him, because I was asking myself the same thing every night. As weeks passed, strange incidents continued to ripple across the missile fields. One night, a team reported lights hovering in formation, 3 glowing orbs arranged in a triangle that drifted silently across the sky. Another time, a guard swore he saw a beam of light sweep across the ground, stopping on him like a spotlight. His radio crackled with static until the beam vanished, leaving him shaken to his core. The reports piled up, but officially, nothing was happening. Every unexplained sighting was filed away as atmospheric anomaly, equipment malfunction, or misidentification. But the men knew better. Harris, my navigator, confided in me one evening in the officers' club. His whiskey sat untouched. His voice was low, steady, but his eyes betrayed the storm inside him. "They weren't interested in us," he said. "It was the missiles." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Think about it. The lights over the silos. The reports of systems glitching. Our bomber only mattered because of what it carried. It's not us they're studying. It's our weapons." The thought chilled me more than the Dakota winter ever could. If Harris was right, then these lights weren't random intrusions. They were deliberate inspections. Tests. Warnings, maybe. And if that was the case, then the balance of the Cold War was a lie. Because how secure were our weapons, really, if something unknown could drift across the prairie and tamper with them at will? The command's response was to double down on secrecy. More briefings. More warnings. More threats. "This is not for discussion," the colonel repeated like a mantra. But suppression only made the memory stronger. Some men broke under the weight. A guard was reassigned after being found trembling on duty, muttering about lights in the sky. Another requested a transfer, claiming he could no longer stand the silence of the plains at night. Even the most stoic among us began to drink more, laugh less, stare too long at the horizon. As for me, I carried a memory quietly. But every time I looked out into the night, I felt the weight of unseen eyes staring back. And deep down, I knew Harris was right. That night in October hadn't been the end of something. It had been the beginning. By the turn of the new year, Minot Air Force Base had settled back into the rhythm of Cold War monotony. At least, that's how it looked on the surface. Jets still flew their training missions. Guards still walked the perimeters of missile fields. And launch crews still sat underground in concrete capsules, waiting for an order they prayed would never come. But beneath the surface, nothing was the same. The incident of October 1968 had carved itself into the marrow of the base. The men who had seen the lights, whether from the cockpit or from the ground, carried the weight of that night like a scar. And even those who hadn't witnessed it firsthand had absorbed the fear through whispers and rumor. It lingered in the air like smoke. You could feel it in the silence that fell whenever someone mentioned the night shift. You could see it in the way guards glanced at the sky during patrols. You could hear it in the nervous laughter that followed any conversation about atmospheric anomalies. One night, I drew perimeter duty at a silo east of the base. The wind cut sharp across the prairie, slicing through my parka, filling the silence with its lonely howl. The snow crunched under my boots, each step punctuated by the metallic rattle of my gear. Beside me was Airman Collins, a young guard whose nerves had never quite recovered from that night in October. He carried his rifle slung tight across his chest, knuckles white against the stock. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "Sir," he said, his voice trembling just enough to betray him, "you ever think they'll come back?" I kept my eyes on the horizon, the stars bright and merciless above us. "They might already be back," I answered. Collins swallowed, his breath steaming in the cold. "Sometimes I think I see them. Out there, just watching. Not close enough to call in, but close enough to know." I didn't tell him I felt the same. That more than once I caught myself staring at a glimmer on the horizon, wondering if it was a star or something waiting, biding its time. Reports still trickled in through unofficial channels. Guards described strange glows in the distance. Launch crews whispered about alarms flashing without cause. One story, passed from man to man like contraband, told an entire flight of missiles going no-go for several minutes, their systems failing all at once, before snapping back online as if nothing had happened. Officially, these were brushed aside as coincidences, malfunctions, weather interference. But unofficially, we all knew better. Too many stories, too many patterns. It wasn't random. Harris cornered me one evening in the officers' club, his drink untouched. I heard something from a friend at Malmstrom. He said, quietly, same kind of thing. Lights in the sky. Missiles offline. It's not just us. That hit me harder than I expected. If it wasn't isolated to Minot, then it wasn't about us specifically. It was bigger, broader, systematic. Do you think it's testing? I asked. Harris nodded grimly. Or a warning. The thought sat between us like a live wire. If these objects could tamper with our most secure weapons, then our nuclear arsenal wasn't as invincible as we had been told. And if they were delivering a message, what exactly was it? We can stop you, we can see you, or we can end you if we choose? The brass doubled down on secrecy. More briefings, more warnings. This is not to be discussed. The phrase became as common as, yes, sir, but secrecy did little to stop the growing unease. Men started breaking. Some requested transfers. Others turned to the bottle. A few admitted openly that they didn't trust the night sky anymore. One guard was found standing outside his post long after his shift, eyes locked on the stars, whispering, "They're still out there." Even those who never saw a light themselves were infected by the fear. The idea was enough. The silence of the prairie became unbearable. Every rustle of wind a phantom. Every flicker of starlight a threat. For me, the memory replayed itself endlessly. I would close my eyes and see the glow pacing us in the B-52, hovering effortlessly in defiance of gravity. I would hear the static-laced voices of guards reporting lights near their posts. I would feel the crushing sense of being studied. It wasn't just a sighting. It was an encounter with intent, with intelligence. And no matter how much the colonels insisted on silence, that truth could not be erased. As winter bled into spring, the fear hardened into something else. Resignation. We realized that whatever was out there, it wasn't ours to control. We could only endure its presence. Like men living under the shadow of a storm, they could neither stop nor predict. But deep down, we all knew the storm would return. The Cold War marched on, year after year. But for those of us stationed at Minot on that October night in 1968, the war had already changed. The enemy we had been trained to fear lived across the ocean. But the presence that haunted our skies was something altogether different. By the early 1970s, the official line was clear. Nothing unusual had occurred. Reports were filed, stamped classified, and locked away. Any mention of strange lights near missile silos was dismissed as weather, atmospheric anomalies, or radar glitches. The government had perfected the art of plausible deniability. But the men who had been there knew the truth. I carried that truth like a secret weight. I stayed in the service, kept flying missions, logged my hours, did my duty. But the night sky was never the same. Every star seemed suspect. Every flicker on radar carried a possibility of being something more. Years later, after I had retired, fragments of the story began to surface. Through Freedom of Information requests, researchers uncovered redacted documents, radar logs, transcripts of radio chatter, testimonies stripped of emotion but heavy with fact. I read my own words in one of those reports. Object observed pacing aircraft. Radar contact confirmed. Object accelerated and disappeared. Sterile, dry, lifeless. What it didn't capture was a pounding of my heart, the sweat clinging to my palms, the knowledge that I was being studied by something far beyond human comprehension. Other men spoke up too. Harris, my navigator, called me one evening, his voice older, roughened by decades, but still carrying that same quiet urgency. "They're admitting some of it," he said. "Not all, but enough to make people start asking questions." I asked him what he thought it all meant. "I don't think they were here for us," he said. "I think they were here for what we carried. The missiles, the bombs. Maybe they wanted to remind us we weren't as powerful as we thought." The words sank deep. For decades, The Cold War had taught us that nuclear weapons were the ultimate equalizer, the final word in human conflict. But if something could glide across the frozen prairie, silence our systems, and vanish into the stars, then perhaps our weapons weren't final at all. Perhaps we were being shown the limits of our power. I sometimes spoke about it in small settings, veteran halls, history classes, the occasional UFO conference where people leaned in with hungry eyes. I never embellished. I didn't need to. The truth was already stranger than fiction. I described the glowing light pacing the B-52, the reports from terrified guards of the silos, the silence that followed when we tried to speak of it. Some believed me. Others smiled politely and dismissed it. A few told me I was mistaken, that memory plays tricks. But memory doesn't play tricks this sharp, this heavy, this enduring. One night, long after I left the service, I returned to mine it. The silos were quiet now, decommissioned and sealed. Grass grew tall where once the earth had been carved for concrete and steel. I found myself standing alone by one of the old sites, the prairie stretching endless in every direction. The air was still. The stars shone with the same sharp brilliance they had decades earlier. And for a moment, I half expected to see it again, a glow hovering silently above the earth, watching, measuring. It didn't come, but the memory did. I realized then that the true haunting wasn't in the sky. It was in us, in the silence we carried, in the questions we could never answer, in the weight of knowing we had seen something the world wasn't ready to face. The Cold War ended. Treaties were signed. Walls came down. The nuclear giants rusted in their silos. But the mystery remained, untouched by politics or time, because whatever had visited Minot that night, it wasn't bound by borders or ideologies. It wasn't American or Russian. It wasn't even part of the Cold War. It was part of something larger, and we had been unwilling participants in its story. I am old now. My hands tremble when I lift a cup of coffee. My voice cracks when I speak too long. But when I close my eyes, I am 25 again, strapped into the cockpit of a bomber, staring at a light that pulsed with intelligence and intent. I still wonder what message it carried. Was it a warning, a test, or simply observation, like a scientist studying ants? I may never know. None of us may ever know. But I do know this. On that October night in 1968, the universe revealed itself. For a brief, terrifying moment, the curtain was pulled back, and we glimpsed a truth far larger than the Cold War, larger than nations, larger than ourselves. And that glimpse changed everything. The following morning, the base felt different. It wasn't the crisp October air or the frost that clung to the prairie grass. It was a weight of something unspoken, something too large to fit into words, yet too undeniable to ignore. Every man who had been on duty the night before carried it in his face, and the way his eyes shifted toward the sky, as if expecting the glow to return at any moment. In the control rooms, officers huddled around radar screens and stacks of reports from the night before. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, throwing a sterile glow on the walls plastered with maps of the missile fields. Red and blue pins bristled across the maps, each one representing a silo, each one marked by a report. When you connected the lines, the pattern became impossible to dismiss. Whatever had been in the skies over North Dakota the night of October 24th had moved deliberately across the missile complex, seen from multiple angles, tracked in multiple ways. The most chilling detail was the consistency. Air crews and ground guards, separated by miles, had described the same thing, glowing objects moving with silent precision, hovering near silos, pacing the B-52 in the air. These weren't scattered hallucinations or drunken tales whispered over drinks. They were converging testimonies, each reinforcing the other, like fragment of a puzzle that revealed only one picture once assembled. And then came the radar logs. Operators reviewed the recordings from the B-52's instruments, confirming what the crew already knew, that an unknown object had been tracked. It wasn't ghosting. It wasn't static. It was a solid return, one that behaved nothing like a conventional aircraft. At one point, the radar showed the object pacing the bomber, holding steady despite the B-52's maneuver, then shooting ahead at a velocity that made no sense. The data matched the eyewitness accounts with eerie precision. Inside the command post, Voices rose in heated debate. Some argued it had to be experimental technology, perhaps Soviet, perhaps even American, tested in secrecy without the crew's knowledge. But no one could explain the silence, the impossible speed, the precision of the movements. And no one could explain why the object had been observed both above the bomber and above the silos, as though weaving its own story across the night. I sat in one of those briefings, the air heavy with cigarette smoke and tension. Reports were read aloud, each more unsettling than the last. Guards spoke of objects hovering just above the fences, beams of light sweeping across the ground. Pilots described glowing forms keeping pace with their aircraft. Radar operators spoke of contacts that vanished and reappeared without logic. The stories blended into one another until coincidence was no longer possible. And yet, even as the evidence stacked higher, so did the unease. Because evidence demands explanation, and explanation was the one thing no one could give. I will never forget one senior officer standing at the front of the room. His jaw was clenched, his hands gripping the podium. He listened as report after report was read, his eyes narrowing, his face impassive. Finally, when the last account had been given, he exhaled slowly and said only 4 words. This did not happen. The words hung in a room like a commandment, not an observation, not a conclusion, an order. And just like that, the tone shifted. We were instructed to file reports, yes, but with precision, with technical language. No mention of UFOs. No mention of glowing objects. No mention of fear. Instead, words like anomalous lights, instrument error, possible atmosphere phenomenon. Words that stripped the truth of its power, draining the terror and awe from the testimonies until they resembled nothing more than bureaucratic afterthoughts. But the men who had been there knew better. The guards who had seen the lights hovering above their silos carried their memories in pale faces and trembling voices. The crew who had watched the object pace the B-52 carried theirs in silences between words. The radar operators carried theirs in data they knew would vanish into locked files. We all carried it. I often think about those rooms, filled with men who had sworn to serve their country, forced to choose between loyalty to orders and loyalty to memory. I remember sitting there, pencil in hand, wondering how much truth to put on paper. Should I write what I saw? Or should I write what I was told to write? Should I protect myself, my career, my family? Or should I risk everything by telling the truth? For most of us, the choice was silence. But silence does not erase memory. It only buries it deeper, like a live wire under concrete, humming unseen but never dead. The official explanation soon followed. A carefully crafted statement was issued. Nothing unusual had occurred. The lights in the sky were likely misidentified stars, planets, or conventional aircraft. Radar contacts were attributed to technical errors, reflections, atmospheric anomalies. It was neat. It was tidy. It was a lie. But inside the base, the men who had seen the lights knew the truth. And as the days turned into weeks, that truth pressed heavier with every order of silence, every official word that contradicted what our eyes had seen, what our instruments had recorded, what our fear had made undeniable. And so the incident at Minot became 2 stories, the one that lived in the official record, sanitized and hollow, and the one that lived in us, raw and unshakable. But silence never holds forever. Whispers grow. Memory endures. And eventually, those memories would break free. The official explanation was issued within days, but its neatness fooled no one on the inside. The statement claimed that nothing unusual had occurred, that lights in the sky had likely been misidentified stars or civilian aircraft, and that the radar contacts could be explained by technical errors. It was a sort of explanation designed not to answer questions, but to suffocate them. On paper, the matter was closed. But inside the base, it was anything but. Everywhere I went, I could feel it. In the mess hall, men ate in silence, eyes fixed on their trays. In the barracks, laughter had drained away, replaced by whispers carried between bunks in the dark. In the guard shack scattered across the missile fields, voices on the radio were sharper, quicker, strained with a tension that could not be hidden. I remember walking into a control center one afternoon to deliver paperwork. The men inside, usually calm, efficient, precise, looked different. One radar operator, his hands jittering as he sipped from a tin cup of coffee, leaned toward another. "It was right there," he whispered, his voice low but sharp. Solid return, pacing the bomber. It wasn't interference. I know what interference looks like. The other man shushed him quickly, eyes darting to the doorway. They saw me standing there. For a moment, the room fell silent. And then, just as quickly, everyone returned to their stations, pretending nothing had been said. But I had heard enough. The hardest part was not what we had seen. It was being told not to trust our own eyes. Reports were rewritten with careful wording. UFO became anomalous light. Pacing became apparent parallel course. Fear became momentary confusion under unusual conditions. Language was being used as a weapon, not to describe reality, but to bury it. One evening in the officers' club, Harris sat across from me, staring into a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. His voice was low, meant only for me. "They don't want the truth," he said. "They want control. If they can't explain it, they'll erase it." I asked him what good erasing did when so many had seen the same thing. He looked at me then, his eyes tired. Truth doesn't matter if no one can say it. His words haunted me, because that was exactly what was happening. The incident was being locked behind a wall of silence, sealed with the threat of ruined careers and dishonor. But whispers don't obey orders. One guard told me in secret that he had seen the object pass directly over his Jeep, so close he felt heat on his face. Another swore the lights had hovered over his silo for more than 5 minutes, long enough for him to feel paralyzed, unable to move or even call it in. He finally did, only to be told to maintain composure and continue his post. None of these men spoke openly, but in quiet corners, when they trusted you, the stories came out. And every story was another crack in the paper shield of the official explanation. As winter deepened, the tension worsened. The long nights seemed longer now. The silence of the prairie was no longer empty. It was waiting. Guards scanned the horizon obsessively. Every flicker of starlight, every distant plane, every glimmer of frost carried the possibility of them. A few men started carrying cameras on patrol, old Kodaks stuffed in their jackets. None of the pictures came out clearly, but the act itself showed the desperation. They wanted proof, something physical, something undeniable. But even if they had captured it on film, I knew the pictures would have been locked away, stamped classified like everything else. I often lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling of the barracks, replaying the glow pacing our bomber, the frantic voices of guards shouting into radios, the hollow command that this did not happen. And I wondered, how long could they keep it hidden? Because truth has a way of bleeding through paper, no matter how many stamps and signatures try to cover it. By December, the first snows had blanketed the North Dakota prairie, burying the missile fields under a silence that was almost unbearable. The silos, once just concrete scars on the land, now seemed like monuments to secrets, massive, cold, and buried both literally and figuratively. The official record said nothing had happened on October 24th. But among the men stationed at Minot, the memory was alive, whispering in every hallway, every barracks, every guard shack. The silence, order from above, only made it worse. What cannot be spoken grows sharper in the mind. For many of us, the lights were not fading. They were becoming brighter with each day that command refused to acknowledge them. I drew patrol duty at a silo east of the base one bitter night in January. The air was so cold it burned the lungs. My boots crunched in the snow, the sound unnaturally loud against the vast emptiness of the plains. The stars were knife-sharp overhead, and every one of them made me uneasy. Beside me was Collins, the young airman whose nerves had never recovered. He was jumpy, scanning the sky as if expecting the glow to return at any moment. After a long silence, he asked a question that had been gnawing at all of us. "Sir, do you think they'll come back?" I hesitated. The truth pressed against my teeth, but silence was what we'd been ordered to keep. Finally, I said, "They might already be here." Collins swallowed, his breath steaming in the air. Sometimes I think they never left." I didn't argue, because I felt it too. Reports continued to circulate, never official, but always present. Guards whisper of strange glows just beyond the fences. Launch crews spoke quietly of alarms that lit up without cause, entire systems flickering off and back on again in perfect unison. One particularly chilling story spread among us. An entire flight of missiles had gone no-go for nearly 5 minutes. Their systems dead. And then, just as suddenly, everything came back online as if nothing had happened. The official report said equipment malfunction. But we all knew better. Harris found me in the officers' club late one evening. His whiskey sat untouched on the table. "I heard from a guy at Malmstrom," he said. "Same thing happened there. Lights in the sky. Missiles offline. Just like here." The realization hit hard. It wasn't just mine. It wasn't isolated. It was happening across the missile fields. "Do you think it's testing?" I asked. "Or a message," Harris said grimly. "A way of telling us they can touch our most guarded weapons whenever they want." The thought sank into me like ice. If that was true, the Cold War balance, the delicate threat that held back global destruction, was a lie. Because if these lights could disable our weapons at will, then none of it mattered. Our silos, our bombers, our nuclear deterrent, all was fragile against something we couldn't understand, couldn't predict, couldn't fight. The brass responded the only way they knew how, with more silence, more warnings, more orders not to speak. The words national security were repeated like scripture, as though they could smother the truth. But the truth doesn't die in silence. It festers. Men began to crack. A guard was reassigned after he was found standing outside his post, staring at the stars and whispering, "They're still out there." Another requested a transfer, saying he could no longer handle the nights. Even the toughest among us weren't immune. Some drank too much. Others grew quiet, withdrawn, haunted. For me, the memory replayed endlessly. The glow pacing us in the B-52, the radio filled with frantic voices, the radar showing a solid contact that moved in ways no aircraft could, and above it all, the unbearable weight of being watched. It wasn't just light. It wasn't just machines. It was intent. And no matter how much the colonel insisted, this did not happen. Intent cannot be erased. By the end of winter, the fear had hardened into something else: resignation. We understood now that whatever was out there, it wasn't ours to control. It came and went as it pleased, immune to our weapons, indifferent to our defenses. The Cold War had taught us to see the Soviets as the enemy, to believe that history balanced on the tension between East and West. But standing on the frozen prairie, staring at the stars, I realized something else was on the field. Something greater than nations, greater than wars. Something watching. And if it chose to return, we would be powerless. The Cold War marched on. New missile systems were tested, bombers flew endless drills, and treaties were signed and broken with the steady rhythm of history. But for those of us who had been at Minot on October 24th, 1968, the war had already changed. Because we had seen something the Cold War couldn't explain, something that had nothing to do with Moscow or Washington. The official record said nothing had happened, but we remembered. Years pass, but silence is gravity. It bends a man inward. It presses on his chest until the weight becomes unbearable. For many of us, that weight never lifted. Some men buried it under alcohol. Others tried to forget, pushing the memory into the corners of their minds where it lurked like a shadow. But shadows don't disappear. I stayed in the service. I flew my missions, logged my hours, wore my uniform with pride. But the night sky was never the same. Every radar blip, every flicker of light, every star that seemed just a little too bright, it all carried the possibility of being more. In the 1990s, fragments of the story began to surface. Researchers filed Freedom of Information Act requests, and documents trickled out. Radar logs, testimonies, reports redacted into near uselessness, but still bearing enough to confirm what we had known all along. Something had been there. Something had paced us, hovered above our silos, and vanished into the night. I read my own words in one of those documents. Object observed, pacing aircraft. Radar contact confirmed. Object accelerated and disappeared. Dry, clinical, lifeless. What it didn't capture was the pounding of my heart, the sweat on my palms, The unbearable knowledge that I was being measured by something beyond human comprehension. I wasn't the only one. Harris, my navigator, called me after decades of silence. His voice was older, raspier, but the tension was still there. "They're admitting parts of it," he said. "Not the whole truth, but enough to stir things up. You think the world's ready for the rest?" I laughed bitterly. The world's never ready. Maybe that's the point. Over time, I began speaking in small venues, a veterans hall, a history class, once at a UFO conference. Though I never liked the spectacle of it, I didn't need to embellish. The truth was already stranger than any story. I told them about the object pacing our bomber, about the guards' voices breaking on the radio, about the silence that followed. Some believed. Some dismissed me politely. Others leaned in, hungry for every word. But belief didn't matter. I wasn't there to convince anyone. I was there because silence had broken me once, and I wasn't going to let it win again. One memory has stayed with me more than the rest. It wasn't the object itself. It wasn't the radar screen. It wasn't even the reports. It was a night weeks later, standing alone in the hangar. The B-52 loomed above me, massive and cold. I ran my hand across its fuselage, the same metal that had carried us through the October encounter. And I realized the plane was a witness too. Steel and rivets remember, just as men do. I whispered into the empty hangar. We weren't alone up there. And for a moment, in the silence, it felt like the bomber agreed. Now I am old. My hands tremble when I hold a cup of coffee. My voice cracks when I tell this story. But when I close my eyes, I am 25 again, strapped into that bomber, staring at a light that broke every rule of the sky. I still don't know why it came. Was it a warning? A test? Or simply observation, the way a scientist might watch ants in a field? I may never know. None of us may ever know. But I do know this. On October 24th, 1968, the universe revealed itself. For one night, the curtain was pulled back and we saw through. And once you've seen, you can never return to ignorance. That is the weight I carry. And maybe it is the gift, too. The weeks after the encounter dragged on like a winter that refused to end. Officially, the incident had already been closed, filed away under the vague phrase, unexplained but non-threatening. Those 3 words became a bitter joke among the men, whispered in mess halls and muttered under breaths in the barracks. None of us believed them. Unexplained, yes. Non-threatening? Not a chance. Life at Minot Air Force Base returned to its routines, or at least it pretended to. Patrols of the missile fields continued. Endless system checks were carried out, the same procedures repeated until they blurred together. Training flights came and went, the roar of B-52s overhead, like thunder rolling across the prairie. To anyone outside, Minot looked unchanged, a fortress of discipline and routine in the frozen north. But for those inside, nothing felt the same. Beneath the monotony, there was a tension none of U.S. could shake. Every light on the horizon became suspect. Every flicker on a radar screen sent a jolt of fear down our spines. The sky had changed for us. It was no longer the vast, empty expanse it had once been. It was inhabited, occupied, not by planes, not by satellites, but by something we couldn't name. The guards had it worst. They had been closest, standing in the freezing prairie dark as the glowing objects hovered above the silos. Their stories didn't vary. Every account matched with chilling precision. Silent lights moving with intelligence, beams sweeping the ground as though searching. Some described the sensation of being studied, measured in ways they couldn't articulate. Others admitted they had nightmares, dreams of being rooted to the ground, powerless as the glow descended upon them. I noticed a change in their eyes. Men who had once spoken with confidence now kept to themselves, words clipped, gazes distant. One young airman asked for reassignment, saying he could no longer endure the night shifts. Another began drinking heavily, stumbling into barracks reeking of whiskey, desperate to drown the memories. None of us judged them. How could we? We all carried the same burden. Inside the launch control centers, officers carried it too. We had all seen or heard the same undeniable evidence. Radar screens confirmed what should have been impossible. The voices of the 52 crew testified to it in real time. The guards' reports painted the same picture with eerie consistency. Yet we were ordered to record nothing unusual, to write in language so sanitized it stripped the event of meaning. That contradiction was a wound that never healed. We told ourselves we were serving the greater good, that silence protected national security, that burying the truth prevented panic, that secrecy maintained stability in a world already balanced on the edge of nuclear fire. But in the quiet moments, alone with memory, doubt crept in. Were we really protecting the people? Or were we protecting those who feared what the truth might mean? During patrols, I found myself staring at the horizon, scanning the night with attention I could never release. The prairie stretched endlessly, flat and merciless. Above it, the sky seemed closer than ever, too close. I wondered if the objects would return. I wondered if they were watching even now, invisible, waiting. Rumors whispered through the base. Men said the incident wasn't unique, that other missile bases had reported similar intrusions. Montana, Wyoming, the same story. Glowing lights above silos, systems failing, silence afterward. Always the same order, always the same erasure. The fear wasn't just that the objects could disable our weapons. It was that they could do it at will, that they could decide in an instant whether our missiles lived or died. And command had no answer. We lived with weapons powerful enough to erase cities, to end the world. Yet something could hover silently above our strongest defenses and render them useless without effort. What did that say about power? About control? About who or what really held it? I ask you this. If you were sworn to guard weapons capable of destroying nations, but saw them silenced in an instant by something you could not understand, would you still believe in the strength of your mission? Or would you, like so many of us, begin to doubt the very foundation of what you served? For me, doubt became constant. It gnawed at me during long nights underground, during endless shifts staring at screens, during every unexplained flicker on radar. But doubts could not be spoken. Not then. So we carried them in silence, each man locked in his own private prison of memory. And as the years passed, that silence grew heavier, until finally, decades later, some of us chose to break it. The weeks stretched into months, and still the order held. Say nothing. The official explanation, unexplained but non-threatening, hung over us like a shroud. It was repeated in briefings, etched into reports, and whispered with bitterness in the mess hall. But it did not heal the wound. If anything, it made it worse. We were soldiers, trained to obey, but obedience does not erase memory. The guards bore the heaviest scars. Many of them confided in me quietly, when no officer was near, when the night was too long to keep their thoughts inside. One told me about a dream he kept having. In it, he stood at his post, the cold wind biting at his face. The oar descended slowly, silently, until it hovered just above him. He tried to raise his rifle, but his arms would not move. He tried to call for backup, but his voice died in his throat. Then the light expanded, swallowing him whole. Every night, he woke up screaming. Another confessed that during the incident, he had crouched behind his truck, weapon clutched to his chest, sobbing silently as the light passed overhead. It wasn't just above me, he whispered. It was in me, like I could see straight through everything, skin, bone, thoughts. These weren't weak men. These were trained guards, steady under pressure, prepared to protect nuclear weapons in the event of sabotage or attack. And yet the lights had broken something in them. In the launch control centers, the contradiction cut deep. We had seen the radar logs. We had heard the voices of crew in the B-52. We had read the terrified words of the guards. And then we had been ordered to record nothing unusual. I remember sitting in front of a console one evening, staring at the neat rows of lights and switches. Everything looked normal. Everything was normal, but memory filled the silence between the blinking indicators. I couldn't stop thinking about the way the orb had paced the bomber, holding steady despite its maneuvers, then shooting forward at speeds we could hardly comprehend. I couldn't stop hearing the guard's radio call, his voice cracking with panic. And I couldn't stop asking myself the question no one dared speak aloud. If they could do that, what else could they do? Some of the men started to crumble. One was reassigned after he was caught drunk on duty. His nerves shattered. Another requested a transfer out of missile fields altogether, saying he couldn't stand the long nights anymore. A few became reclusive, speaking only when spoken to, their eyes forever scanning the horizon. The brass responded the way brass always does, with more discipline, more briefings, more warnings. The phrase national security became as common as "yes, sir." But discipline didn't touch the fear. Harris pulled me aside one evening. His face was pale, his jaw set. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what we saw, about what the guards saw. It wasn't us they were interested in. It was the weapons." I frowned. "You're sure?" "Think about it," he said. Every sighting was near a silo. Every report mentioned the lights hovering over launch facilities. RB 52 only mattered because of what it carried. They weren't studying us. They were studying what we built. The thought sat heavy in my stomach. If he was right, then the lights hadn't come by chance. They had come with purpose. And that purpose was our nuclear arsenal. It was a terrifying thought. The Cold War world was built on illusion and control, that the missiles in their silos and the bombers in their hangars guaranteed deterrence, guaranteed security. But if something could sweep across the frozen prairie and silence those weapons at will, then deterrence was an illusion. Security was a lie. We still wore our uniforms. We still saluted the flag. We still performed our duties with precision. But inside, cracks were forming. Doubt spread like frost across glass. Thin at first, but impossible to ignore. And yet we said nothing. We couldn't. The burden of silence was heavier than any weapon we guarded. I often wondered, were we protecting the public from panic? Or were we protecting the fragile idea that humanity was still in control of its destiny? The truth gnawed at us all. And as winter deepened, the silence did too. By February, the endless nights on the prairie seemed longer than ever. The snow lay heavy across the fields, turning the missile sites into white islands scattered across a frozen ocean. The guards trudged through their shifts, their boots crunching against the ice, their breath clouding in the air. Silence was everywhere, but it was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of waiting. Officially, nothing had happened. The reports had been sanitized, the files locked away, the words rewritten into harmless phrases. Atmospheric anomaly, radar interference, possible misidentification. But among the men, the truth persisted. In hushed conversations behind closed doors, in half-whisper exchanges during long shifts, the story was retold, reshaped, and reinforced. One night, during a patrol near a remote silo, Collins, the young guard whose nerves were always frayed, spoke the words many of us had thought, but never admitted. "They could shut it all down," he said, his voice trembling in the dark. "Every last one of them. If they wanted to, they could take it all away." I didn't answer at first. The wind whistled against the chain-link fence, carrying the sound of emptiness across the plain. Finally, I said, "Maybe that's the point." Collins turned to look at me, his breath fogging in the air. His eyes were wide, glistening with fear. "Then why let us keep them at all?" I had no answer. Stories spread quietly, like contraband passed hand to hand. At Malmstrom, men whisper of a flight of missiles that had gone offline after strange lights were seen overhead. At F.E. Warren, guards spoke of glowing spheres that drifted above silos before shooting into the sky. None of it made it into the official channels, but we heard it all the same, and it was always the same pattern. Lights above the silos, systems failing silence afterward, always followed by the same erasure. In the officers' club, Harris leaned close to me one evening, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "This isn't just mine," he said. "It's everywhere. They're watching all of it. All of us." I asked him what he thought they wanted. He shook his head. Maybe to remind us we're not in control. Maybe to warn us. Maybe to test us. I don't know. He paused, his eyes narrowing. But I don't think they're here by accident. The word sent a chill through me deeper than the Dakota winter, because I believed him. The brass, of course, doubled down on secrecy. More briefings, more orders, more threats. The phrase national security was hammered into us until it became meaningless. But fear has a way of slipping through cracks, and the cracks were everywhere. Men began breaking in quiet ways. Some drank more. Some stopped sleeping. One was caught standing outside his post, eyes locked on the stars, whispering, "They're still out there." Another demanded a transfer, saying he couldn't stand the nights anymore. Even those who seemed steady carried the weight in silence. You could see it in their eyes, in the way they scanned the skies too often, in the way they flinch at flickers on a radar. For me, the memory replayed in endless loops. The glow pacing us in the B-52, the radar showing a solid contact that defied every law of physics, the voices of guards breaking over the radio, and above it all, the unbearable weight of being studied, as though we were insects under glass. It wasn't just light. It wasn't just machines. It was intent, and intent meant intelligence. By the end of winter, resignation had set in. We understood now that whatever was out there wasn't ours to command. It came and went at will, untouchable, unstoppable. The Cold War told us the struggle was East versus West, a fragile balance of terror between two superpowers. But standing on the frozen prairie, staring at the sky, I realized something else was on the field. Something greater than nations, greater than wars. Something watching. And if it chose to return, there was nothing we could do. The years passed, and the Cold War rolled on. New missile systems came online, new bombers filled the skies, and new treaties were signed and broken. But for those of us who had been at Minot that October night in 1968, none of it felt the same, because we knew something the rest of the world didn't. The Soviets weren't the only ones in the game. I stayed in the service. I wore the uniform, saluted the flag, flew my missions, but the sky was never the same. Every star seemed suspect. Every radar contact carried the possibility of being more. I would lie awake in the barracks, staring at the ceiling, and wonder, were they out there now, watching, waiting? Some of the men carried the memory quietly. Others broke under the weight. Collins left the service early, unable to shake the fear. Harris stayed, but he grew quieter, the fire in his eyes dimming year by year. A few never spoke of it again, burying the memories so deep it became a scar invisible to the world. But scars remain whether seen or not. In the 1990s, whispers of the incident began to leak. Through Freedom of Information requests, researchers unearthed fragments of radar logs, transcripts, reports. Redacted, sanitized, but enough to show the truth beneath the ink. I found my own words in one of those documents. Object observed pacing aircraft. Radar contact confirmed. Object accelerated and disappeared. Cold, clinical, stripped of meaning. What it didn't capture was a pounding of my heart, the sweat slick on my palms, the knowledge that I was staring at something beyond human comprehension. I wasn't the only one. Harris called me one evening, his voice older, worn by time, but still carrying the weight of that night. "They're admitting pieces of it," he said. "Not the whole story, but enough. Think the world's ready for the rest." I laughed, bitter and tired. The world's never ready. Maybe it never will be. I began speaking little by little. A veterans hall, a classroom, once a UFO conference, though I disliked the spectacle of it. I didn't need embellishment. The truth was already unbelievable enough. I told them about the glow pacing our bomber, the guards shouting into radios, the silence that followed. Some believed. Some smiled politely. Others dismissed it outright. Belief didn't matter. I wasn't telling it for them. I was telling it for me, because silence had broken me once, and I would not let it break me again. One night, years after I had retired, I returned to mine it. The silos were decommissioned, sealed with concrete, forgotten by history. Grass grew tall, where the most powerful weapons in the world had once slept. The prairie was quiet, the air still, the stars sharp and unyielding. I stood by a rusting fence, staring up at the sky, and I half expected to see it again, the glow, hovering silently, watching. It didn't come, but the memory did, and in that moment, I realized something I had never admitted before. The true haunting wasn't in the sky. It was in us, in the silence we carried, in the truth we buried, in the knowledge that, For one night, the universe had revealed itself, and we had looked away. Now, in my old age, I still carry it. My hands shake when I hold a cup of coffee. My voice cracks when I speak too long. But when I close my eyes, I am 25 again, strapped into the cockpit of a B-52, staring at a light that broke every law of physics. I don't know why it came. I don't know what it wanted. Maybe it was a warning. Maybe it was a test. Maybe it was nothing more than observation. But I do know this. Once you've seen, you can never unsee. Once you've known, you can never unknow. That night at Minot changed everything. And no matter how many files are stamped classified, no matter how many statements are issued, no matter how many officers say, this did not happen, it did. We were there, and we remember. Decades passed, but the night of October 24th, 1968 never left us. For years it lived only in silence, buried in classified files, hidden behind official denials, whispered among veterans who trusted each other enough to remember together. On paper, it was nothing more than a technical anomaly, an unexplained glitch that carried no real meaning. But in memory, it was something else entirely, a night when the sky revealed its presence and our defenses proved powerless. When I retired from the Air Force, I carried that night with me like a scar no one else could see. I'd built a life outside the service, raised a family, grew old under the same North Dakota sky. But whenever the stars were clear, I would catch myself scanning them, half expecting to see that impossible glow once again. For a long time, silence was my duty. Silence was my shield. But silence never erased a memory. It only made it sharper, as if each passing year carved the details deeper into my mind. It wasn't until the 1990s that the silence began to crack. Researchers filed Freedom of Information Act requests, and slowly, fragments of the official record emerged. Reports from Minot confirmed that radar contacts had been tracked, that guards had reported glowing objects, that the B-52 crew had witnessed something extraordinary. The words were buried in technical jargon, softened with careful phrasing, but they were there, enough to suggest that the impossible had indeed been logged. Then came the testimonies. Retired officers, no longer bound by fear of losing their careers, began to speak. Some were cautious, their voices hesitant, as if decades of silence still clung to their throats. Others spoke boldly, declaring that the world deserved to know. They described the same things we had all seen, glowing objects pacing aircraft, hovering near missile silos, tracked on radar with undeniable precision. Hearing their voices was like hearing my own memory read aloud. The details matched so closely it was impossible to dismiss. They remembered the fear, the silence, the contradiction between what we saw and what we were told to report. They remembered the impossibility of it all, and the weight of carrying that impossibility alone. In later years, documentaries and books revisited the Minot case. Analysts studied the radar data, compared testimonies, pieced together timelines. Some argued it was proof of something beyond human technology. Others dismissed it as misidentifications, equipment errors, the tricks of tired eyes. The debate continues even now. But for those of us who were there is no debate. Because once you have seen a glowing object hover silently beside a B-52, once you have heard guards report lights sweeping across missile fields, once you have watched your instruments confirm what your eyes refuse to believe, you do not forget. You do not explain it away. You carry it. I sometimes ask myself what it meant. Was it a show of force, a demonstration that our most powerful weapons could be disabled at will? Was it a warning? A reminder that humanity was not the only force capable of destruction? Or was it something even more enigmatic? An observation, a study, a glance from something that regarded us the way we regard ants beneath our feet? I cannot say. But I can ask you this. If you were given the choice between living in ignorance, believing the sky holds only stars, or knowing that it also holds something far more powerful, far more mysterious, what would you choose? Would you prefer the comfort of not knowing or the burden of truth? For me, truth is the heavier weight, but it is also the only honest one. Today, Minot Air Force Base still stands. Its silos still dot in planes. Its bombers still fly in their endless patterns. New generations of airmen serve there, perhaps unaware of the night in 1968 when the sky itself reached down and reminded us of our limits. They carried the same duty we once carried, the same readiness, the same silent promise. But I wonder if they know how fragile it all truly is. Sometimes when I think back, I realize the most frightening part was not the object itself. It was the silence that followed, the insistence that nothing had happened, the rewriting of memory into official denial, because denial does not erase reality. It only isolates those who have seen it. And so the story of Minot lives in two worlds, the world of documents and denials and the world of memory and witness. I belong to the second. As long as I live, I will carry the glow of that night in 1968. The impossible light that hovered in the sky above North Dakota and reminded us all that our greatest weapons could be turned into silence. And I know, as surely as I know my own name, that it was real. When the first documents surfaced in the 1990s, they were incomplete, heavily redacted, their words chosen to conceal as much as to reveal. But for those of us who had been there, they were enough. A single sentence buried in a report could bring the entire night back into focus. Object observed pacing aircraft. Radar contact confirmed. The analysts who studied those documents looked at them with fresh eyes. They debated in conferences, published papers, and argued on late-night television shows. But for the men who had lived that night, no debate was necessary. We didn't need experts to tell us what we had seen. The truth was already etched into our memories, sharper than any paper trail. I remember attending a small gathering of veterans in the mid-90s. We met in the back room of a VFW hall, the walls lined with faded photographs of wars past. Most of us were older now, our hair gone gray, our hands slower. But when the subject turned to Minot, time fell away. It wasn't ours, one man said firmly, slamming his fist on the table for emphasis. Not Soviet, not American. Don't care what the reports say. Another nodded. I was on guard that night. That thing came down low. No sound, no heat, just light, moving like it knew exactly where it wanted to be. Their voices carried the same tension I remember from decades earlier, the weight of certainty colliding with the impossibility of belief. By then, the FOIA requests had unearthed enough to confirm the basics. Radar logs showed solid returns. Transcripts recorded guards describing glowing objects. Official reports noted anomalous lights in language so cold it stripped away the human fear behind it. But buried beneath the technical phrasing, the truth glimmered. One line described an object maintaining relative position with the aircraft. Another noted that security teams reported visual contact with luminous phenomena. Each phrase was like a crack in the wall of silence, letting a sliver of memory escape. For outsiders, those cracks were evidence. For us, they were validation. Still, the denials continued. For every document released, there were officials insisting nothing unusual had occurred. For every testimony given, there were skeptics ready with explanations, whether balloons, atmospheric refraction, pilot error. I used to grow angry at those explanations. But over time, I came to understand. It's easier to dismiss the impossible than to live with it. It's easier to believe the sky is empty than to admit it is not. Yet the memories persisted. Harris and I spoke often in those years. His voice was rougher with age, but the urgency never left it. They could have shut the whole thing down, he told me one night over the phone. Every missile, every bomber, everything we thought made us strong. He paused and added quietly, maybe they did just to show us they could. The thought haunted me more than anything else. Not just that they could disable our defenses, but that they could do so at will, and leave us with nothing but silence. In those years, I began to write. Not official reports, not testimonies, but personal notes. Memories scribbled in notebooks. Sketches of the cockpit, maps of the missile fields with arrows marking where the lights had been reported. It was my way of refusing to let the silence win again, because silence had been the true weapon all along. The world outside moved on. The Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall fell. New conflicts rose and fell. But the night of October 24th, 1968 remained frozen in my mind. Not because of what we saw, but because of what followed. The denial, the erasure, the command to forget, that was the deeper wound. The lights had shown us our limits. The silence had forced us to live with them alone. By the early 2000s, the Minot case had become a fixture in certain circles. Researchers, UFO enthusiasts, skeptics. Books were written. Documentaries aired late at night. Debates flared on television and in print. To most of the world, it was just another mystery, one more unexplained incident lumped with Roswell and countless other stories. But to us, it was not just a story. It was our lives, our memory, our burden. I attended a conference once, against my better judgment. It was in a hotel ballroom, the kind with faded carpets and buzzing fluorescent lights. A panel of researchers sat at a long table, microphones squealing, stacks of papers in front of them. They spoke of radar returns, of eyewitness testimony, of inconsistencies in the official reports. I sat in the back, listening. Their words were careful, academic, measured. They treated the incident like a puzzle to be solved. But for me, it wasn't a puzzle. It was a scar. During a break, a young man approached me. He had heard me mention, almost under my breath, that I had been at Minot. His eyes lit up with curiosity. "Were you really there?" he asked eagerly. I nodded. What was it like? I opened my mouth, but for a moment no words came. How do you explain to someone who has never felt it? The way the glow pulsed brighter when you looked at it, the way the air seemed heavier, the way the silence pressed on your chest like a weight. How do you explain the contradiction of seeing the impossible and being ordered to pretend it never happened? Finally, I said, "It was real." That's all you need to know. It was real. The young man looked disappointed, as though he had wanted a dramatic tale. But I couldn't give him more. Not in that moment. Harris and I stayed in touch through those years. He never liked the conferences either. Too many people looking for fame, he said once. Too many treating it like entertainment. For us, there was nothing entertaining about it. When we spoke quietly, as if the silence of the 1960s still lingered. We remembered the guards' voices cracking over the radio. We remembered the radar screens showing solid contacts that danced across physics itself. We remembered the fear etched into every face. Sometimes, Harris told me, I think the silence was worse than the lights. The lights lasted minutes. The silence lasted decades. He was right. As the years wore on, I began to feel the weight of memory more acutely. At night, when the stars were clear, I found myself searching in the way I had as a young man. My children asked me once why I always looked at the sky. I told them it was habit. But the truth was, I was still waiting for the glow to return or for the silence to break. I wrote more in those years. Notebooks filled with sketches, maps, fragments of memory. I wasn't sure who I was writing for, myself, my children, or some future historian who might finally piece it all together. Maybe I just wanted proof that I had tried to hold on to the truth, even as the world preferred denial. One night, in my study, I took out the official report again. I had kept a copy, though I was never supposed to. The words stared back at me, unexplained but non-threatening. I laughed bitterly. That phrase had followed me all my life. But the truth was, it had been threatening. Not because the lights attacked us, but because they revealed how powerless we really were. That was a threat. The knowledge that our mightiest weapons, our carefully balanced world of deterrence and destruction, meant nothing in the face of the impossible. And that was something no government wanted to admit. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if we had spoken sooner, if we had refused to obey the silence. Would the world be different, or would we have been silenced by other means? I'll never know, but I do know this. Memory has its own gravity. The longer you carry it, the heavier it becomes. And by the early 2000s, that weight was almost unbearable. Now I am old. My hands tremble when I write. My voice cracks when I speak of the past. But one memory remains as sharp as the day it was etched into me, the night of October 24th, 1968. Decades have passed, yet it feels as close as yesterday. I close my eyes and I am back in the cockpit, the glow burning against the glass, the impossible silence pressing on my chest. I hear the frantic voices of guards on the radio. I see the radar returns flicker with certainty, and I feel the weight of knowing we were being studied, watched, measured. I've lived a full life since then. Marriage, children, grandchildren. I've built, I've loved, I've lost. And yet through it all, that night has remained with me, woven into every year like a thread of fire. In recent years, younger men and women have asked me about it. They come with notebooks, with cameras, with microphones. Some are researchers, some are journalists, some are simply curious. They want a story. They want proof. What I tell them is simple. It was real. That is all they need to know. I don't embellish. I don't dramatize. I don't claim to know more than I do, because the truth itself is already extraordinary. Sometimes I return to mine it in my mind. I see the frozen silos, the endless prairie, the long nights of patrol. I see the guards shifting nervously in the cold, scanning the skies. I see the B-52 hulking and massive, carrying us into the dark. And then I see the light, always the light. It hovered there, silent, deliberate, undeniable. And then it was gone, leaving only questions that have never been answered. I think often about silence. The silence of the official record. The silence of the officers who told us to forget. The silence of the men who buried their memories until they carried them to the grave. Silence was a true enemy all along. But silence cannot last forever. Memory endures. Whispers spread. Documents surface. And stories, no matter how deeply buried, rise to the surface like embers from a fire. One evening not long ago, I found myself in an old hangar, standing before the fuselage of a B-52 much like the one we flew that night. Its skin was cold to the touch, its sheer size humbling even after all these years. I placed my hand on the metal and felt a rush of memory, as though the plane itself remembered too. I whispered to it. We weren't alone up there. And for a moment, in the stillness, I almost felt the bomber agree. I know my time is short now, but before I go, I want to leave this behind. We were there. We saw the glow. It was real. And no matter how many files are stamped classified, no matter how many officials insist this did not happen, no matter how many skeptics roll their eyes, we remember, and memory is a force that cannot be silenced. Sometimes when I look at the stars, I wonder if they will return, not with fear, not with dread, but with a strange kind of longing, because for all the terror that night, there was also awe, a reminder that the universe is bigger than our wars, bigger than our weapons, bigger than us. And maybe, just maybe, that was a lesson, that we are not alone, that we are not as powerful as we think, that silence cannot bury truth forever. I carry the glow still, and until my last breath, I will tell you this. It was real.